Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to this wonderful interview with Davey D and Jeff Chang for their young adult edition of Can't Stop, Won't Stop, which just dropped. It's an amazing document chronicling the history of hip hop from the 70s up to now. So without further ado, I'm just going to drop in some bios and we'll get on to the questions. Jeff Chang has written extensively on culture, politics, and arts and music. Born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, he is graduated from the Iolani School, the University of California at Berkeley, the University of California at Los Angeles. He's written the adult edition of Can't Stop, Won't Stop, which won the American Book Award, and Who We Be, which was a New York Times editor's choice. DAVEY D COOK is a nationally recognized journalist, adjunct professor at San Francisco State University, hip hop historian, political commentator, syndicated talk show host, radio programmer, and a media justice and community activist. Without further ado, everybody give a warm virtual welcome to Davey D and Jeff Chang. How you guys doing? What's up?
We're good. We're good. Before we start off, we got to acknowledge a couple of birthdays. One, it is the birthday of the one and only DJ Kool Herc.
That's right.
That's his birthday today.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And, we'll acknowledge the birthday of Selena for all the Selena fans out there.
Oh, nice.
There you go.
On the same day.
Huh?
They're on the same day.
That's right. Well, my wife told me.
Okay.
She walked around with a Selena shirt on. I'm like, whose birthday? Oh, yeah.
Oh, we got to celebrate hip hop and Selena's.
Yeah, hip hop.
Anything for Selena's, Yeah. So, tell me, how has the reception been like for this new edition of Can't Stop, Won't Stop? What have you heard from everybody who've picked it up and read it?
So far so good. It's been good. No, it's been great. It's been really actually wonderful. I mean, just to be able to have this book have this kind of a life, and then now for us to be able to get a chance to my editor kind of came to me and was like, we should make this available for a new generation. And we're both hip hop dads, hip hop parents. So we thought it was a good time to be able to do that. And it ended up being actually stunningly on point because, we had turned in a draft and then everything kind of, happened last year, right? The pandemic came down and all the, sort of racial inequities that accompanied that, right? In terms of who was getting hit with the virus, who was falling prey to the virus. And then, of course, the murder of George Floyd and the sort of uprisings that occurred after that, 25 million people in the streets. So we were like, oh, hold on, stop the presses. We have a lot more to write about here. So the book now kind of travels the length of, starting with Black Power in the late 60s, going all the way up to Black Lives Matter in 2020. And to be able to kind of have that be available for our kids, for, my nieces and nephews and the folks who'll come afterwards, that's been a blessing.
How has it been that you brought in Davey into this equation? Because I, for one, have been a fan of Davey's writing for so long, and being able to see him as a co-author was pretty much an exciting thing. So, Davey, can you talk about that process of Jeff asking you, or has it been something that's been brewing for a while?
Well, we were just talking the other day. Jeff is a godfather of writing, historical stuff.
No.
And we got the call, and we don't call him Jeff in our circles. We call him Shug Chain. So, it's like I have a book. I'm going to recontextualize it. We need you on. It's like, well, let me think about it. He said, no. It's no thinking. You're going to be on. So that's how it came about. No, me and Jeff been friends for a while.
Long time.
A long time. And, he reached out to me to see if I wanted to be a part of it. And, of course, I mean, Can't Stop, Won't Stop was a landmark book that changed the trajectory in which, hip hop books have been written in terms of how it covered things. If you go back and look at many of the books, a lot of it started and ended with the trilogy of Bam, Herc, and Flash. It didn't give a social political context too much, and with a lot of names and dates. And he went deep into some of the things that folks often said, like, hey, the gangs ended when hip hop emerged. Well, did that really happen? Who are these gangs? What was going on? And and the thing is, when he wrote it, because I think it was like 10 years it took him to do it, something like that. So it was a long time.
Wow.
And, and he's living in New York, which means you got to go down to 42nd Street to the main library. And you don't have computers there in the 90s, not like that. So you got to go microfiche. How do I know? Because I had to do that. So if you wanted to look up an article, say in the New York Times, you had to go to the library. I'm looking for, April 28th in the New York Times. And then they give you this little film and you got to go to a machine and you got to put it in there and you got to look and then read the article and then find out that article's only 2 paragraphs. So then you got to go back and you got to go to the library and I think I need another one, and you had to look it up on the index cards, right? Yeah. So that's an arduous process of having to look up stuff. And when you're talking about Black people and you're talking about hip hop, you're looking at people who, that in most publications of record aren't going to really cover it in a way that makes sense. So you have a lot of detective work to do. And I don't think people can fully appreciate it. When I was writing, I had a little bit easier time because I lived in the Bronx and I kept journals. So my referencing point was like, oh, there was a guy named Bam and there was a guy named Disco King Mario. And I didn't have to go to a library and look that up. I could ask a couple of people and get information and back check it that way if I didn't see it myself. But Jeff is a whole different situation. He's not from New York. And so he doesn't know if somebody's lying or not. Somebody could come along and go, oh, it was invented by, Mr. Ed. So he's got to check.
Famous Mr. Ed.
Famous Mr. Ed. So the whole microfiche thing, that is, I'm just giving you an idea that is an arduous, well, you're a librarian, so
Oh, yeah. So you're mentioning things that probably are out or, stored away in storage somewhere, but we still get people who have to come and, check out the film because that's where the records are, for older newspapers, documentation. Yeah. And, if they're not digitized, they're in a box somewhere.
Right. Yeah. And then once you read those articles, because again, I started off by saying our story is not given full credence. So you have to do detective work. Okay. So for example, I think you told me when you found out about the Peacemakers a long time ago, right? So okay, so the Peacemakers. So now you got to know when he's saying Peacemakers, like I'm keeping the peace, or you got to know that's a gang, right? Which they were. Then you have to find out, okay, the New York Times mentions the Peacemakers, who's in the Peacemakers, right? And that requires a lot of detective work. So if you're doing the work, then you go, oh, Curtis Blow is a peacemaker. So then you have to, and some of those pioneers don't want to give up information or they exaggerate. So I don't know if you talk to Curtis, but, let's just say you go, Curtis, what do you know about the Peacemakers? Maybe he doesn't want to tell you, or maybe he wants to exaggerate. Oh, the Peacemakers with me and Naru, who's in the audience. So now you got to go to Naru and figure it out. And, by the time you're done, doing all that, then you might have enough for a paragraph. Yeah. I mean, literally a paragraph, because the Peacemakers weren't a major part of the gang truce, for example. They're there, but they weren't the integral part, so that's all the detective work. So I'm glad I didn't have to do that.
But Danny, let me tell you something. So like what you all might have like heard implied in what Davey was talking about was that Davey was there. Davey was born you weren't born in the Bronx. Were you born in the Bronx?
Yeah, born and raised.
You were born okay, so born and raised in the Bronx and was there in all of that type of stuff. And the thing that he wouldn't tell you right now is that he actually had turned a lot of that stuff that he had in his journals into a book. And that book should have been out before Can't Stop, Won't Stop. So like we can tell you all this story, you know, because Bay Area story, you know, but the bottom line is for me, Davey like was somebody that I looked up to and still look up to, first of all because he's older than me, we but also
Why?
because yeah, I respect my elders, but also because Davey like literally brought that connection out to the Bay Area when he moved out here in the 1980s. And not to date him, but you know, during the 1980s, just to say it was the 1980s that he actually moved out here. Did I say the night? Say anyway. Um, but Davey like laid it down. He was the one that really brought out the rigor in terms of hip hop, like to say this is a real important art form because he had lived it and brought it out here. And he is like to me the finest hip hop historian out there. Like he's the one who's holding all these stories, and I've just been able to be lucky to be able to be around this dude, kind of going to school and hanging out, watching him DJ, and all through the years and stuff. And so for me, it was like when Monique told me, "Oh, you know, we want to do this again." I was like, the first person I called was Dave on this, and I didn't thug him out and actually ask him to do it. I was just like, "Please, Dave, please, please, Davey, please." Like,
That sounds like Jeff.
yeah,
But
and
but it's important
yeah.
that what you're saying is definitely, you know, given the fact that Davey, you know, was around it, you know, he's a living primary source, right? He was on
Oh
the
man,
street, and you
yeah,
can tell in the narrative in the book that, you know, I didn't get to read the, you know, the older edition to compare, but
yeah.
it seems like I'm more immersed, especially during those first beginning
That's
chapters.
all Dave. Yeah, that's all Dave. That's absolutely all Dave.
It was
So
brilliant. It was so, it makes hip hop almost seem like a fantasy story, but this was reality. You know, it was just I was amazed by that, because of,
So,
yeah.
so let me give larger context to it. You know, in our communities, you know, and I'm talking right now for Black community, a lot of our narratives are commodified, and a lot of our narratives are they don't have us as the center. So, like, if we tell a story about the South Bronx to somebody, they're like, "Ooh, let's talk about the fires, and let's talk about the gangs, and let's talk about, you know, the mayhem," and that's sensational. And maybe somebody like myself and others would be like, "Well, let's talk about the ingenuity, and let's talk about the fight." You know, so for example, there's a documentary that came out from somebody who, you know, grew up around the same time, and she talks about how many of the people in the Bronx got together and rebuilt. They reclaimed a lot of those buildings that were burnt out, and they rebuilt them for themselves. Right? It was Occupy way before Occupy.
that's,
Right?
that's
That
it.
is a narrative that doesn't exist. Every documentary that comes out goes, well, this is what's happening, but they don't talk to those people that went and rebuilt those buildings on Kelly Street and others. They don't talk to the gang members who chased out the junkies and protected those neighborhoods, right? That story's not told. They don't talk about the racial animosity that existed, that I grew up with, that many people grew up with, which meant that your projects, the safe haven was the housing projects. The safe haven was the hood, you know, because folks knew that, hey, man, if you're from here, we're going to protect you, because your biggest enemy were going to be those Irish and Italian kids that was like, you can't come to Arthur Avenue, can't go to Pelham Bay, can't go to Country Club Road, can't go to those places. And so there's a different type of relationship, and it's nuanced. And so, yeah, you know, did the Spades do, you know, Black Spades, did they do some transgressive things? Hell yeah. But I also remember when the pool around my block up on St. Lawrence, I believe it was St. Lawrence, you know, when the white kids came in there and started beating up the Black kids. Well, yeah, you know, 500 people crossing over the freeway from, you know, Bronx River or Bronxdale over to where we were at. to be like, check this out, like ran up in the building and, and started taxing everybody, what some people would have seen as transgressive was like, oh, thank God you got those kids that were calling us the N-word and all that, like what happened in South Carolina the other day. So those types of things we remember coming up, that that there was a different type of relationship. And how that all relates to hip hop in the end is that hip hop primarily is about community. Mm-hmm. And but community just didn't start with hip hop, it was already merging. And there were already these different type of relationships that were fostered by very in your face oppression that many people were dealing with, right? So yeah, I live in Soundview. I don't know the kids across the street, but when we leave to go downtown, we're leaving together as a unit. And there's going to be a bond around that because that unit is your protection. It's hard to put into words unless you lived it, and I'm by no means am I old enough or am I as knee deep into the intricacies as some of the other people that were around where they could really tell those stories. Let me give you an example. One night, Disco King Mario was being honored at Bronxdale Housing Projects, and I was there, and it rained. And so I'm there with Sundance and, the original Sundance, who's like an original Spade. I'm there with Amir and all these people. And I'm listening to them tell these stories, right? And they're like, oh, remember when this happened? Remember when that happened? So a lot of things that we heard about, details got filled. So when the Spades crossed the freeway, to come down, I'm hearing their side of the story for this, right? For the first time. It's like, remember when this happened? And then them telling how they even set that up. Or you heard rumors about people going up to Castle Hill. And then, you're hearing people joke, remember we rode the bicycle? So they actually had a military strategy that they got from the Zulus in South Africa where they sent, scouts first in the morning and then everybody came later at night. And they came because Castle Hill housing projects refused to go along with a peace effort. So it's like, man, we had to let them know there's going to be peace or not. So just to hear those type of stories is important because it gives you context. Mm-hmm. And it also reminds you that there were people that were thinking in ways that we can't fully appreciate until they actually tell those stories. But I think in the book, in both the original copy of Jeff's and the second one that we did, we're trying to let people know about the agency of people, the people looking at their world and saying, how can we make it better? The intentionality of certain things coming together. And they're doing this in the backdrop of the Black Power movements being dismantled. They're doing this in the backdrop of the NYPD having a purple squad that was coming after people left and right. They're doing this in the backdrop of policies that Jeff laid out that, we're like, hey, man, take away social services from these people, right? We're talking about benign neglect as being advocated by Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And if you ever look at that memo, he's like, ignore these Black people and start paying attention to Puerto Ricans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and everybody else, and middle-class Blacks. Forget these other folks that are kicking up dust. He actually says that in his memo, right? So you're talking about folks who are like really, for lack of a better word, they're left to their own devices. Mm-hmm. And a Vietnam War that's happening, where people are coming home and they went to war at 19, they're coming back at 20 and 21, and they're the ones that's picking up the heroin and going out. So the pioneering generation of hip hop had older brothers and sisters that weren't there for them, and uncles and aunties that were systemically moved out. So people had to make a way out of no way. That's the importance of it in the political context that we tried to lay out.
Anything to add, Jeff? Because when the important thing I find that, especially in context of Black and brown culture, especially in hip hop, like you said, these stories do not get told, and often enough, you have to either know the individuals who are part of it, and sometimes you got to be in earshot or privy to their ability to share that knowledge, right? How much more content was kind of cold to add to this new edition?
Yeah, I mean, these aren't the stories that are in the microfiches sometimes, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, that's part of one of the things that we always say is like hip hop has hip hop's a repository for all of these really super important histories that are constantly suppressed by the mainstream media, and by mainstream sort of even the way that mainstream history is written and that kind of thing. So you know, the this book has never been really about kind of the mainstream part of it all, but it is saying that these are the stories, and this is what Dave and I talked a lot about as we were putting this edition together. These are the stories that need to be passed on, because if they're not passed on, then people don't have a full sense of who they are and what they're capable of. You know what I mean? What people are capable of, which is an important thing over and over again, because you know, as we grow up, who you know, folks who are not white in this country, um, so much is taken away from us. You know, like so much of our history, so much of our languages are taken from us. A lot of times, to the point where it things don't make sense. And so Dave talks about agency all the time. It's like people need to be able to know, young people need to be able to know that young people stood up over and over again through history and through their own creative powers were able to overcome these kinds of forces. I mean, the one thing that's stronger than oppression is our ability to be creative in overcoming it, you know? And I think that that's the beauty of it. That's the gift of Black freedom culture to all of us who are not Black, of African descent. Um, and it's the stuff that we wanted to make sure that we had captured in this particular book. So
And
there's a lot of stuff. I mean, there's a lot of new stuff in here. About I'd say about maybe 65% of the book is updated. Obviously, it goes all the way up to 2020. But we're talking about, you know, the first edition ends in 2000, and we add 20 years of history into this book, to try to bring everybody up to date.
the other thing that I would say that's also important is to note that hip hop didn't just come out in a vacuum,
Mhm.
but it's a continuum,
Mhm.
right? And so it's a continuum, and freedom fighters like the Young Lords, freedom fighters like the Black Panthers, freedom fighters in the Nation of Islam and the 5% Nation, now Nations of Gods and Earth, and others were constant presence to early folks in trying to give them information, even as some of their respective organizations were being dismantled and discredited, right? So if there's a politic that hip hop picked up, it was because those seeds were being planted by others who were being marginalized and being, maligned by the state. So that's important. The last thing I'll say, because people often ask about, oh, it's a young adult edition. Well, remember, it was young adults that created this culture. It was the young teens and adults that created the culture. Sure, Kool Herc is 65 years old today. And, and some of the people we write about are in their 60s now, but they were 15, 14, and 17 and 18 when this started. And we're giving you their perspective of when they were doing these things, not when they're sitting back in a rocking chair and saying, well, this is what I did. Maybe some of those people told us the stories, but, we had ways in which we were able to glean the full accounting of that story. And so I think what you find with it is that it's not written like a regular history book with Western construct of like, on August 11th, Kool Herc gave a party. On August 12th, we went to the party. It's not written like that. It's like we tell you about
You
Kool
missed the
Herc's
party.
party,
You
but
missed the party. If you went on
yeah,
August 12th, you missed the party. Right?
yeah, but a lot of history books are dates and times,
It's true. That's
and
exactly right.
we're giving you a different type of understanding into the history, you know. So we're giving you the narratives that are around that, and those narratives are important because it I think it does capture the mindset of somebody who was that young at that time, which is why I think somebody in 2021 can see themselves in that, because you're like, oh, okay, you know, these weren't 30, 40-year-old people doing a peace treaty. These were folks that were 17 and 18
Mhm.
who were doing a peace treaty and going at it 3 and 4 and 5 different times before they got it right. Um, those are important things. And even if people don't fully appreciate it, at least it's in the record.
Mhm.
You know, it's in the record the same way that textbooks that are being rewritten right now are going to be in the record 10 years from now saying that enslaved Africans were immigrants and workers, right? So history is a fault line. And our ability to write history and be truthful is an act of resistance when so much of it is being dismantled and being, you know, I mean, literally, you know, made up on the spot. It's a lot of revision going on that you're just like, oh, that wasn't really happening,
Mhm.
So it's important to capture those.
And it's for myself, I'm a little younger, I guess, from to you guys. And so when I grew up in hip hop as a child, in the late 80s and then the teen into the 90s, I, as a Vietnamese American, I was trying to find solidarity in my identity. I was born in Oklahoma, moved to California in the late 80s. And, I didn't understand, multiculturalism. When I came here, it was either, oh, it's no longer just only white. It's everybody here. And so, but what I found the commonality with youth culture at that time, like anything, was hip hop, and I was trying to grasp my understanding of that, and but my education and my schooling in the culture didn't necessarily happen until late in high school, also college, understanding where this comes from, where hip hop comes from, the struggles, the solidarity, the activism that made it, happen. And that's why I find that not just because you name it a young adult edition, I think education, cultural education in hip hop and other subcultures in our zeitgeist in the world needs to happen. Why do you think that's not happening still, in our public school system? It's like, why would you have to wait till we go to college? I mean, it's just an open-ended question, but I feel like I would get frustrated when it doesn't happen. I feel like we're not equipping our next generation with the tools to understand our world.
I mean, it's a big question, right, Danny?
Right.
Like, I think first thing is shout out to the educators who are making this kind of stuff available to their young folks, to their youth. There's all kinds of structural reasons, right? Why we're not taught this type of stuff. And then, in some states, like there's literally, like Dave is talking about the textbooks in Texas, for instance, where you've got like these, you know, commissions that are put together by the state to literally rewrite the textbooks so as to whitewash history, literally whitewash history, literally like say, like make it seem as if slavery was voluntary. You know what I mean? To literally erase like the whole history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, the histories of colonialism, colonization, and all of these different ways in which the U.S. is, treated working people, treated women, treated queer folks. All of those types of things need to be kind of recovered, and so that's part of like what we write against all the time, just as and what we are talking against, like Dave as a radio announcer and as a professor, like that's his work. Me and the work that I do, that's what it is that we do. You as a librarian making this stuff available to folks, right?
Like, yeah.
So yeah, so it's yeah, it's a large thing, and that's a large part of what we write against, so that in the long run, we can feel like, okay, we've put this out there, somebody can come to it. We're hopeful and we're thankful for the thousands of hardworking teachers and professors and just like educators, just folks who have been passing the book around and that kind of thing, so that folks can kind of see. What's the real?
The success of the first book gave us a lot of privilege that the average person, if they was to write a book right now, don't have.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Jeff comes to the table with a success story, and a lot of the marketing that came about was Jeff and his relationships, not the other way around. That's important to note. The reason why, and I've written, and Jeff has written for places where, give you an example. One time I was asked to write an article for a major newspaper, right? I'm not going to give their name, but major. And it was around Van Jones, right? And Van Jones was being said, hey, he's a hip hop activist, blah, blah, blah. Great. This is when he first got into the Obama administration. So I wrote the article, and it was important for me to mention the late Kilu Inuyasha, former Black Panther, and contextualize that she sat a lot of people in hip hop at her knee and gave them political education, right? Talking about political prisoners and gave, and I started naming off all the different artists. It was important to talk about the upper room, right? Both in San Francisco and when it moved to Oakland, and talk about the late Rafiq Bilal, right? And I gave this history, and I said, this is what is the undercurrent that gives rise to hip hop activism and somebody like Van. And that paper was like, nah, we're not running all that, because that wasn't the sexy story. And, but it's like, yeah, but this is the story. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but we just want to know. But if you put Van without the context, then you're going to lead people to believe that this is something that popped up overnight, and you don't see that he was part and parcel to a long line of people that had always used culture as a way to politically engage people, right? There's a whole history. You just can't erase that. And, to me, I said, you all give context to everything else when you write the articles. You'll give people all this time. It's like, well, we only have, 300 words to do it. If we run the article, then we can't run it in the paper. Well, then put it online then. It's online, but it's like, but I don't want to reduce this rich history to 300 words. And I certainly don't want to take out, people like Kilu and Rafiq Bilal, because you know what? If you're a major paper, when somebody Googles their name, this should pop up on your site. That should be a part of the record. And I'll close with this. Here's why this is important. I wrote for another newspaper. I won't say their name. And the only time that I ever got edited from that paper was when I wrote about the election of 2004. And in that, I talked about that the election, that there were discrepancies in the election, and that, there was some cheating that was going on in the state of Ohio. And I started laying that out. And it was like, well, you can't say that. Huh? Well, you can't say that. And then when you started to see the pushback from the election, they were like, there's no major paper that even says these allegations when they had hearings about the thing. And I was like, that's why they told me not to do it, because I'm in a major newspaper. And if I write it and you Google it, there's the column. There's somebody who's working for the paper making the same case that people who are protesting it in the Congressional Black Caucus was, right? So it's a fault line. Mm-hmm. History is a fault line, and you want to be able to do this. So we had the ability and the privilege of being able to put as much history as we could, and we had to go through the vetting process, sit with lawyers, did this happen? And they had to check, and you had to give all those receipts. But you know what? It's there. It's there for forever. Ain't nobody coming and rewrite what we wrote. You can challenge it if you want, but we did our due diligence so that 10 years down the road, when they go, oh, this hippity hop stuff, it wasn't that important. These people never did anything. Nah, there's 2 books that say otherwise. Mm-hmm. Here's a whole Here's 500 pages on one and 300 pages on the other that give you dates, times, and places and context. Here's policy that you can look up, because now when you look up some of those policies, it might not be there. They might not say Daniel Patrick Moynihan and benign neglect. They might not say J. Edgar Hoover and COINTELPRO in the same sentence, but we do. Might not talk about Daryl Gates and his policies of containment and militarization of police, but we do. It might not talk about the gang truce in LA, right? We do, with the names and numbers and the times that it happened, not for history's sake, but so folks who are marginalized and often ostracized can go, no, damn it, here's some proof. This really happened. You know, it's right here in this book, you know, and this is a major book. So yeah, we had a task, and, you know, and because of the success that Jeff had, you know, where people might have said, I don't know if this is going to sell. I don't know if this will work. You know, those are the types of things that happen. This isn't a Google trending topic right now, right? Which determines what actually goes in some newsrooms. We didn't have that problem. It's like, you know what, Jeff, you already know what you're doing. You know, you already won awards for this. Have at it. So we were able to, you know, even extend the deadline and say, let's write about George Floyd and the pandemic. Not a lot of places would have done that. They would have been like, nah, your book is done, son. Hand it in. And we would have handed in something, and people would have been like, how'd you miss George Floyd? It was important for us to be able to capture those moments. That does not happen when you're doing publications like that. You know, it never ever happened. So, yeah, I mean, I'm glad, you know, and it could never happen if he wasn't there. If he hadn't done that heavy lifting, they had to sit back and go, you know what, we trust you to do that. But if David walked in there by himself, you know, the book would have been, you know, it would have stopped. When did we stop initially? I think in June of 20. We stopped in
or something, 20. I can't
yeah,
remember.
yeah. We stopped way before. Yeah, we stopped in June of 1919, right? And then
1919.
yeah, 1919.
That's when Dave was like, yeah, when Dave was like 15 years old. More than
2019. Yeah.
No, but let me say this too. Actually, let me add this though. I want to say that the reason I was able to do that the first time around and the second time around is because I had a Black woman editor, which there, you know, when I first came into the publishing industry, you know, like way the heck back in 1919, there was like, yeah, there were very few editors of color, and I had Monique Patterson, and she had my back at every turn, you know, and she kind of, I don't even know the kinds of fights she had to have internally to be able to get the book moving. And it's different now because there's a lot more. There's still not enough, and there's still underrepresentation for all communities of color, Black, Indigenous, especially people of color, you know. But Monique stood by the book, so that's a testament to what happens when we're able to kind of get into the publishing industry, excuse me, and to be able to kind of make our presence known. Is the stories that get put down and into print and then distributed to folks. They make a big difference. Dave too, you know, Dave being in on the radio. Dave was a pioneer. Dave like helped to break hip hop nationally by his presence being here in the Bay, and then being able to move it up, you know, so in the way that he did. So,
well, I got those emails threads where Jeff would be like, yo, check this out. You know, we're not going to hand the book in on May of 1919. We're going to need a couple extra months. Okay.
Till the end of World War One.
And they'd be like, okay, the deadline will be August. You have August.
That's
so
we
finish it. Yeah. And then Jeff would be like, hey, you know, I hate to break the news, but you know, we're gonna need a couple extra weeks and blah, 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 blah. And you know, like I said, I don't know what they said, you know, I just seen the email, and then it's like, okay, you handed it in December. And next thing you know, the pandemic was hitting, and you know, and then it was like, hey, you know, pandemic's happening. We can't we can't just sit there and let that go. We gotta cover it. So the deadline was moved, but I'm saying, most people couldn't have done that. And even if you did it independently, just the things that you set up to do, you just can't do that. I mean, people be like, hey man, you set up for the printing September, deposits in, we need, I mean, it's just not as easy to do. And so that was a big deal. I learned a lot from watching that.
I mean, just being able, you guys reiterating, being able to move the needle on that due date, just to add in more context to the book, not, especially a historic document, not many people can do that, That's why it sounded so, current when I finished it. I was like, wow, they're able to talk about what's happening now. I mean, we're talking about a, pandemic year, which kind of paused, activity around community, but it didn't stop the world. We're going through so much, racial injustice and so much, other issues that, showing the loose strings in our society to, unthread. But because of this book, I've seen so many more books come out by other authors. And I don't think it, to say that Can't Stop, Won't Stop was the starting point, but there's so much more about LA rap, about regional hip hop, and not just the music, but the stories, which was so important. The practitioners, the store owners who signed the tapes in the South, it's amazing. That's why I loved about the chapters you spoke on, especially about, New York during the gang truce, and even the LA, Bloods and Crips, those stories came out and they were alive again, just to reframe, because often enough, hip hop gets seen as only a youth thing, even though it starts from youth, but it's, like 40 plus years now, and it's still looking as a juvenile thing. It's like, we're past that, It's, this $1 billion industry is making money for people, and it's still being, seen with kid gloves. It's kind of crazy to me.
Well, it's not with kid gloves. It's called dehumanization. And part of the dehumanizing, decolonizing process, right? There was enslavement and there was colonizing. Colonizing had people looking at various populations as the little kid, right? What was it? The proverbial little brother. These are kids. They're not adult enough to really understand, So that's a form of oppression and marginalization. It's one that says that you're not fully developed, that your stories don't really count. And so we're told this is youth culture and we need to move on and not ever establish a foothold to institutionalize the very things we create. But the people in this music industry are not youth. They're 80, 70. They've been around for decades. The ones that took advantage of the artists today are the ones who took advantage of your father and mother before, and your grandma and your granddad, before that. They've been around, and they're very aware that it's youth culture only in the sense that it makes economic sense to reinvent the wheel for particular populations so they don't have to pay anybody, and they can kind of throw Jeff today, Dave tomorrow, Danny the next day. We can throw it away, but but the machinery is 30, 40 years old. The machinery and the mechanisms and the touch points that they use to distribute product, that's around, right? So the grizzled old distributor, he's still or she's still there, while me and you are interchangeable. What it is that when you juvenize particular people, then everybody is, you can move them like, they're disposable. And we're not disposable. We have rich histories that we need to latch on, and we need to build on that. Cultural wealth, is just as important as economic generational wealth. If you can convince a population that, hey, James Brown is irrelevant to you, you're the new James Brown, and you don't even know what James Brown went through, that's a power play by people who'd want to take advantage of the potential that would emerge from a new James Brown type of figure and control everything and never have the type of agency that Brown had. So you don't tell the history of him owning radio stations. You don't tell the history of what it took when he did the song. You don't talk about him and the Panthers and what back and forth they had for him to even do Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, or what mistakes he made when, he was forced to do disco records. That's all lost, and we can't do that. We can't allow that to happen on our watch. So we're intentional about making sure that there's rooted history in that when we do our story, that we pass the baton to other people to tell these stories that you're talking about, the regional stories. So you don't have to tell the South Bronx story again unless you are from the South Bronx. You got that history. Now we can hear about Seattle, which there's a book out. We can hear about Houston, which there's a book out. We can hear about St. Louis and other places where they can tell the 30 or 40-year history that these respective cities have now without necessarily going over some of the stuff that we laid out.
In with that respect, would there be new additions to Can't Stop, Won't Stop, or is it in your hopes that with more people writing about history of hip hop, or they're from their perspective, the narratives that need to be uplifted? Do you think you guys are good with this version, or you guys you might the next 15, 20 years come out with another one?
I mean, I'm good, man. This is a lot of work, dude. I mean, writing books is no joke. Now, it honestly, like in the first edition, I had written that it was not meant to be anybody's definitive type of history. It's just meant to be a contribution, and so there's a bunch of stuff that have come out, of late, that we love. I mean, I love, like, Clover Hope's got this book, The Motherlode, about women in hip hop, 100 plus women in hip hop, beautifully illustrated, incredible book. And our good friends, Rob Kenner, just got this new book out about Nipsey Hussle. That's just an essential book. It's so important, called The Marathon Don't Stop. And then our good friend, Bay Area legend, this Filipino American legend, Rocky Rivera, has got a new book out called Snakeskin. Yeah, exactly. And she's been a pioneering hip hop journalist as well as P&I rapper, and so everybody's got the stories. I mean, hip hop's a story machine. So we're just hoping, that this will be able to continue. Sometimes in the industry, you get this thing where it's like, oh, this book sold, so there's going to be a glut now of books, and then there won't be anything on it. But what's been dope about hip hop publishing is, after Can't Stop, Won't Stop, there are a lot of amazing books, and it hasn't really slowed at all. So we're Born in the Bronx. I want to shout out. There's a new edition of Born in the Bronx.
Got that one.
Amazing book by Johann Kugelberg and Joe Conzo, our homie.
Right.
Beautiful book.
Paradise Gray and Giuseppe. Did the thing on the Latin Quarter.
Yep.
They're all important.
Yep.
They're all important, and some of the stuff that we do, we build off of others, like Ricky Vincent's History of Funk. How important is that? He lays down that blueprint. So when we talk about, say, the Bay Area, we talk about a funk movement. We don't have to rewrite Ricky's book. We can pull those touch points and go, yeah, there was a funk movement here. What? Funk movement? What are you talking about? So when you go look for it, oh, here's these books on funk. You see what I'm saying? And so it's all a big giant cipher, when you look at Rob Kenner's book, right? He does touch on some of the LA history, but he doesn't have to go as in depth, because now there's, City of Quartz and other things have covered some of that important ground. So he can really get into the intricacies of Nipsey, and contextualize it in a way that he doesn't have to write 500 pages explaining so much that others have done. And we hope that with this book, it allows people the same sort of process. Like, you know what? We got this story. Now let's go dig deep, and you'll have language. There was systemic oppression. There was agency, there was intentionality, there were, young people making a way out of no way. Those type of ethos you can really bring to the forefront, because hopefully you read this and you go, okay, I got that now. I understand what they mean when they're talking about, say, the Bay Area's history or Houston's history or Detroit's history.
And no Jiggy era? No chapter on the Jiggy era? No?
I think we covered that.
Yeah,
We covered it.
Yeah.
All right, maybe I missed it.
You know what? I don't think we identified it as the Jiggy era, because the Jiggy era is in the middle of three things.
Mhm.
It's in the middle of the G-Funk era.
Mhm.
It's in the middle of the East-West Coast War.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's in the middle of, the crack epidemic.
Mhm.
But we talk about Biggie, we talk about Puff, we
Mhm.
talk about that. But the Jiggy era in many ways is looking at, what was Jiggy, with like the materialism and people coming into mogulism, which I think is an important story, but
Mhm.
it's if you leave out the context of independent hustle, which we do focus on, then you just see Puff show up and you think like he just did this over. No, you're part of a long line of people
Mhm.
who've been doing this hustle for a long time. And that's the beauty. Like, you're able to I wouldn't say capitalize, like you just exploited that, because he was part of that hustle ethic himself. But there's so much more. The Andre Harrells that precede you, right? The Russell Simmons, Rick Rubin, Jazzy J story that precedes you. All those things are part of the mogulism that came to personify the Jiggy era. But there's also political and economic stuff going on. Telecommunications Act, the election that gets stolen in 2000. Hip hop activism fighting against welfare reform, and the crime bill,
Right.
that eventually shows up. All that's happening in the middle of the Jiggy era.
I was just joking, guys, but
Oh.
I'm glad for that very eloquent answer. I was like, yes, we're gonna hold on to that. Before we wrap up, what's next for you guys? I know, Jeff, you've been working on a Bruce Lee book for a while, and any other projects by you, Davey? We want some more books by you for sure. What's coming up on the pipeline?
Well, I told Jeff last time, I said, I'm good with books, because this was a long process. And when we got off the thing, he went into Suge mode. No, there will be more books from you, son. And then he hung up the phone.
There will be more books from Davey. I promise you right now that there will be more books from Davey.
I
The
hope so.
Godfather has spoken. Yes.
Yeah.
No, there's definitely gonna be more books from Dave. For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. All right.
I mean, there's so many stories that are there. I think, right now we should be just taking in this moment. Look at all that's gone on the past year.
Mm.
I mean, and it's still unfolding. All the fights around police accountability, the pandemic and the inequality that's shown up. I'm just taking that in, and I'm making notes of all the different things that are emerging. Who knows? I think this is going to be something that we look back at 10, 20 years from now. It's going to be a lot of questions and a lot of assessment and a lot of people that are going to have to be held accountable for their actions or lack thereof. So keeping notes on that, which I've been very intentional about, will be important. I'm not doing it for the sake of writing a book, but I'm doing it for the sake of making sure that, we don't lose track of what happened in the fog of things. If you go down the road, it's easy to forget. If there's any authenticity or feeling that you get when you read these early chapters, and it's because we were able to capture the moment, because a lot of those moments were written in real time. At least my parts, they were written in 77, 78, 79 in journals. I wouldn't remember all that stuff for now, but I wrote them down in my journals. This is what I said. This is what I did. And I wasn't keeping account of hip hop. I was just keeping account of my life. And I just happened that hip hop was like, oh, I went to the T Connection. You know, Grandmaster Caz was there. There was Shaw Rock. I wouldn't remember these things had I not written them when they were happening and how I felt. You know, it's like, damn, man, Shaw Rock is bad. You know, that's not me reminiscing. That's what I actually wrote. You know, so those things are important to kind of keep those things today. Because somebody will rewrite that and try to erase all this stuff and be like, you know, Donald Trump was a hero. He gave out the pandemic and, you know, they will, you know, the people who stormed the Capitol were, you know, revolutionaries and everybody who protested police brutality were terrorists. I mean, people will really rewrite history and frame it that way. And there will be people that believe it. You know, if you don't believe me, look at what they're believing and not believing right now.
And that's why we fight it.
Yeah.
We research and give them the facts. If they don't like it, that's tough nuggets sometimes. But
Yeah.
you know, we're here to just give them the truth, you know, or what's been given to us and documented in part. Any last words, you know, shout outs and me call to actions for our audience and everybody else who will be watching this later?
Just thank you for having us. It's been another tough week, I think, in the world. And it's sometimes it's just real, disheartening, to kind of wake up and look at all that's going wrong. How our young folks are getting killed, and uh, it's a tough period. But one of the things that we try to take heart in is, again, folks have figured out how to do this over and over and over again. And if nothing else, like, we just want that book to be in your library so that people, young people, generations of young people can kind of pull it out and just be like, wow, they did that in the face of that. Like, it's, to us, this is like the greatest story ever told. And it's something that every once in a while we just have to remind ourselves, like, it's, everything is worth fighting for, because it makes it better for the folks who are coming afterwards. So yeah.
I will say that, I would ditto what Jeff is saying, but also remind you that hip hop is constantly, the expressions around it are constantly emerging. And core to those expressions are resistance. And part of the resistance, I would say, is not to be commodified, not to allow yourself to be two-dimensionalized, but to be three-dimensionalized. Look at the bridges that are being built and look at resistance. So, we're in the middle of times where we're seeing all kind of crazy stuff happen to our Asian brothers and sisters. And there were narratives that were trying to pit two communities that are marginalized against each other. And look at how people across the board said, yeah, I see these news reports, but I know something different, right? And as people saw these unity, all of a sudden you didn't see that be front page news, 500 people downtown Oakland, 600 people over here, folks who they're saying, that group of people, they don't like you. And then all of a sudden, finding out that there were behind the scenes phone calls, and the next thing you know, everybody's rocking together, right? Those are important stories. That's not going to be captured by the mainstream because that doesn't sell, right? That's not a sexy story. That doesn't keep communities divided. That's going to be us to tell that story of, like, how people were able to capitalize off relationships, many of them rooted in hip hop. Many of them forged through that. We were able to get on the phone and go, check this out. What's going on, right? What's really happening? Have those hard conversations and go, oh, okay. So that person, that person's disrupting. This person is, and then exchange notes and go, okay, this is how we're going to get down, right? And then have people get pissed. And then, then all of a sudden we have a slew of, police killings, from Adam Toledo to, Dante Wright to, all this stuff, right? And folks are like, okay, how are we going to respond? And you see people stepping up. Are we going to continue to step up? And it may be reflected in the art. It may be reflected in some of that, but I think most importantly is that people now come from a culture that is rooted in resistance. And I think they're going to shun the temptation to cash in and go along just to get along. And they're going to be like, nah, you guys have overreached, ain't going to work this time. And that will be part of the story that we tell, at these moments. So I think the best is yet to come. We're just we're just one stop on this long train. There's a whole crew of people coming behind us that's about to take it to some other level. And that's going to be a beautiful thing to watch out for.
Thank you so much, Davey. Thank you, Jeff. I agree. Just seeing the trajectory of what, not just if you're talking about hip hop, but the urban culture that uplifts people, it's changing in our literature, it's changing in our airwaves. There's more hip hop podcasts. I've never seen so many out there talking about the story of hip hop from the artist and the people's perspective. But yeah, I see a change in the positive light. But just like you said, we all have to keep going in order to see that. Thank you for spending time with me and talking with you guys. And thank you everyone out there checking out this amazing talk with Davey and Jeff.
Thank you.
Please pick up Can't Stop, Won't Stop, any edition out there, and support your library institutions. Read more books, because I know it's a slow form of consuming knowledge and information, and it's not fun sometimes, but there are audiobooks. It's all good. You can go on your run and cook and just listen to these two guys, make hip hop live live, right? Everybody, please enjoy your evening. Be safe out there. Support one another, and we'll catch you next time. One love.
Peace out, everybody.
Thank you.